So, would you guys prefer a light theme? Let's check this out. What do you think about that one?
Easier to see.
Yeah? Easier to read? How's that look? A little bigger too? Can I get like a thumbs up? You good with that? Yeah? Awesome. Okay, cool. Yeah. Yeah, we'll get started if that's all right. All right. So, and were there any other questions or no? Good. Okay. Okay, so we're gonna talk about Hashketball, the lab that you all should have gotten to and all done. Do you guys have a question? Or
Yeah, I can't find. I can't find my Hashketball list right now.
you might have to switch the track at the top. Yeah.
No, I got it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, you don't have to worry too much about like grabbing your Hashketball. I actually thought of like the reason that I asked you for your laptops is that we could do some like pull requests, but I think the way that it worked out was fine. But yeah, feel free to look at the solution that you have. That's fine. We're not going to go through the entire Hashketball lab today. But we're going to get started somewhere, and if you have any particular questions about any particular methods, we can cover that. We are mostly we're going to talk about the num points scored, and Nick already mentioned earlier that in the solution it's maybe a little complicated because like some of the methods are like split into separate methods, right? So we got like we don't just have one method like solving all of our problems, but we have things like split up, which is generally a good idea, a good thing to do in programming because it makes your code very reusable, right? And I'll show you an example of that. So one thing we can do here, what do you guys usually do when you get to labs? Like, run tests, run learn. Do you know what else we can run to run the tests besides learn? RSpec, yeah. RSpec, could someone help out Nick there? RSpec is, learn does the same thing. All it does is really just run the tests. Learn is, the flat iron way of like running things. But if you don't have the learn gem installed, you don't have all those things set up. In order to run Ruby tests, we just run RSpec, right? So we can run RSpec here. I'm in my terminal. I'm in my terminal within VS Code. You don't have to run things within the terminal in VS Code. You can run in a separate terminal. Totally up to you. This is just one way of doing it. So I got like all these errors here. Is there an easier way for me to just like get just one error? Yeah.
Fail fast.
Awesome. So I can say RSpec --fail-fast, or that's just one. Awesome. Let's pull this up a little bit. Or I can say RSpec --f-f. Same thing. Fail fast, just shorter. Well, we're all here to learn something, right? Right. So what fail fast does is it just runs one test at a time, just the first one, the first error that comes up, it runs that one. Yeah.
Is there a way to like check, so if you do like a notable, if you want to check what the key and values printed out, is there a way to like, just write like a quick key value, quick key?
You mean like print something out, or?
Yeah, how would you go about printing out
Yeah.
when you're pressing a new?
Right. So one thing that I like to do, and we're going to get into that as well, is use pry, binding.pry. Can I get a show of hands who's used pry before? Yeah, cool. So you can use pry. You can also print out pieces of code. So you can say something like, how would I print out code to the console? Someone know? I can use p. I can use puts. What was the other one? Print, absolutely. All of these are valid. They do a little bit different things. A lot of students tend to just use puts. Print will put things like on one line. I think P will print it out and return it at the same time. Yeah, puts is like a very common one to just kind of print something out. Right? We can use all of those, and we will learn some debugging along the way while we like code this out. Cool. So we ran this one test because we learned about fail fast. That's pretty cool. So this num point scored, this method, what it's supposed to do, it's supposed to give us the numbers of points a particular player has scored, right? So we have this player name that's being passed into our method that will allow us to then eventually find the player and how many points they scored. Up here, I have our game hash. This should look very similar to what you did in your Hashketball. We have an away team, we have a home team. Each team has a name, colors, and a list of players. Right, we got players here, that's a key that points to an array of player objects. Cool. So how do we figure this out? There are a couple of notes here, a couple of things we want to do. First of all, we want to get a list of all players. That might help us find the player that we're looking for. Then we want to find the actual player, and then we want to get the points that belong to that player. There are so many different ways that you could do this. So if you did it a different way, don't worry. They're just not necessarily one way is better than the other. They're just different. The reason that in the solution sometimes things are broken up, like I mentioned earlier, is that we're trying to make our code more reusable. And you're going to learn this more and more throughout the program. A lot of times what you tend to want to do is just write everything in one method, like get it to work, right? And that's fine. And that's like totally okay. One thing that that I will mention like over and over again is something called red-green refactor. Has someone heard of that? Does someone know what that means? So we ran our tests, right? Yeah, you want to give it a shot?
Basically, like get it to work and then make it better.
Yeah. So we ran our tests. We got a bunch of red, right? Nothing's working right now. Tests are failing. We try to get it to work. We get the tests to go green, and like we fix the problem. And then later we can worry about refactoring it. And refactoring just means like making our code better, making it more reusable, and making it maybe easier to understand for someone else that's reading our code. Does that make sense to everyone, like what refactoring means? That word's going to come up over and over again, right? So with like these goals in mind, what we can do is we can come up with a couple of like things in our head that maybe a couple of methods we want to write in order to achieve this goal. So something that I can think of, because we have this hash that contains a whole bunch of like different keys. We got the like team name and the colors. We don't really care about that stuff, right? All we want really is we want to like get one of these players and find information about like that particular player. So what I'm thinking is we might want to grab just an array of all of the players so that we can then like iterate over that and find the one player we're looking for. And this is where that whole like, using different methods comes in. And again, you can do this different ways. This is just one way of doing it. So I might want to define a method that will get me all the players. And someone have an idea of what I might call that method? Get players. That's great. This is like another important thing to remember. Name your methods so that they make sense to you, to other people, right? If I named this potato, no one would know what this method is doing, right? It's getting a potato. It doesn't make any sense. If I name it get players, it kind of makes sense to someone that's reading it. Oh, this is supposed to get all the players. Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. All right, so my method get players. I want to grab all the players, And what I have available to me is my game hash, right? That I defined up at the top. So that's what I'm going to start with, this game hash, because that's what contains all of my information. Can someone think of like a way to maybe grab items from the game hash? Yeah.
At each method,
We can iterate, yeah. So the game hash itself, let's start right away with like binding.pry debugging, right? Especially with these hash labs, one thing that I can always recommend to you guys, use a lot of pry. So it's really, really hard sometimes with a big hash like that to figure out exactly where everything is, what each variable it looks like, that kind of stuff. So if we use pry, what do we need to do in order to use pry? What was that? We need to require it at the top. Awesome. All right, this is already required. Done. Work done. Great. What else do we need to usually watch out for if we want to use pry?
Yeah. You want to make sure there's no errors before where you put it, because then it won't.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good one. How do you like install pry? What if I don't have it installed?
Gem file.
Yeah. How do I install a gem?
Use bundler. I forgot the timeline.
So if I just want to install it in my, all gems are actually installed like globally. So if I want to install a gem, I happen to already have the pry gem, obviously, but if I wanted to install a gem, I can say gem install pry. Hit enter, and this will tell me looking for pry, installing pry, 1 gem successfully installed. Right. I can do this. I can also, in a lot of labs, you will have a gem file that will contain certain gems that are required to run that application, to do the lab. If you have a gem file, you can just install the gems from the gem file. We don't need one here because I'm really just like using pry. So all I need to worry about here is requiring pry at the top, and then I can get started by just like putting a binding.pry in here. So let's say I want to put a binding.pry in here. Is this gonna work if I run this? What do I have to run in order like?
And you have to call a method, right?
I have to call a method. Yeah, very good. So if I run rspec fast right now, nothing will actually happen, right? We're just like, we're still getting that like same error. We're not hitting our pry. And it is because we're not calling this method anywhere, right? So where might we want to call the method? What's that?
just below.
Yeah, we can call it somewhere down here if you want. We also know that our program is trying to execute our num_points_scored method. So whenever we run the spec file, it is going to try to figure out if that method is correct. So we could also put it inside of our num_points_scored method, because this method will then call this method, right? So if we give this a shot, we are now in a pry. Both ways will work. Right. All right, so we're in the pry. We can look at our game hash now. Cool. And this is pretty much what we saw up there. Nothing too crazy here, right? This is our game hash. If you get this colon at the bottom, you can hit the up and down arrows to kind of scroll through, right? That just means that there's more text than it can display at once. That's not a bad thing. It just means that there's a lot. Does someone know how we get out of this in order to get back to the main prompt?
Does Q work here?
Q, yeah. Hitting Q will get us out of this long text, right? So whenever you're stuck in there, like, don't get frustrated, just hit Q. And you'll be doing this a lot, so you get used to it. All right, so we got out of this long text. We're still in our pry, right? Still in our pry down here. We can do stuff down here. So if we have our game hash, If I say game hash dot count, if I want to get like the length of the game hash, how long it is, what do you guys think we'll get? 2? Why do we get 2? Exactly. We only have these 2 keys, home and away. So if we say game hash dot count, we get 2. Awesome. So how do we actually get to our values of this game hash? Someone know what we could use there? Game hash dot something to get a one thing that you might have noticed already. Ruby is very intuitive in what the method names are called, right? So if I try to get the values, what do you think the method might be called? Values, right? Okay, let's try that. So if I'm trying to get not just the key, I can also get the keys, but if I'm trying to just get the values, I can just type in game hash dot values. This will give me all of the values for this game hash, which is really just like the team name, the team information, right? It omits these keys, the home and away, because we don't really care about those. And we just get like the team information. Cool, so we can work with that. Any questions so far about what we're using here? So now that we have the values, someone mentioned that we might be able to like iterate over this, right? With maybe like a each or something like that. So let's try that out. So we know that we can grab all the values by saying game hash dot values, and then we could iterate over those values. And we could say each will work, right? We can say each, do, and then let's end that as well. Cool. Let's throw our pry up a little bit. Need to name this. So if we have game hash values and we iterate over them, we might want to, let's see, what do we want to call this? Like team info maybe? Team info, right? So that's like for each time that we iterate, we get like info about that team. So all I did here is I grabbed the code that I just wrote in my binding.pry down there, put it in my like actual method right here. And since I'm iterating, like I added the dot each, and now I threw the pry inside of that dot each. So what I'm doing here is I'm coding very much like step by step. Right, so I figure out how to do one thing, I paste that into my code, and then I'm going to run the tests again to figure out, like, to kind of go a step further. So let's exit this. Someone know how to exit pry? Exit. Easy enough, right? All right, let's run this again. And again, I put my pry now inside of my iteration. And I can look at my team info, which is info for just like one team, right? So we got the team name, we got the colors, we got the players, which is kind of what we want to get at. And if I hit Q here, get out of it, since we're in an iteration, we have like many items, right? What if I hit, can someone tell me if I type in exit here, what will happen? Yes, we move to the next iteration. So notice that our first result here was the team, the Hornets, right? If we exit and we look at our team info, we can say that this is now our next team, the Brooklyn Nets, right? So because we're in an iteration, I hit exit, we get to the next piece of the iteration. And it would just kind of keep going like that until we're out of that iteration. Cool. So from this team info, that still doesn't get me my players. How do I actually go about like grabbing just the players out of that team info? Yeah.
Sure. So this is a hash, and one of the keys in this hash is called players. And the value for the associated value for the player's key is an array of players, and that's the information you want to grab.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can use sort of a bracket notation
Mm-hmm.
with the symbol key inside of the bracket. brackets to access that array of players.
Awesome.
And then you can do stuff with it.
Cool, absolutely. So in order to get to the actual array of players, we are just going to grab that key of players, which will return us the value of it, the value that points to. If we hit enter here, we actually get just a, let's see, where was that? An array of players. So it starts right here, right? You can always tell an array, obviously, by the square brackets. If we scroll down, these are all of our players for that particular team. Awesome. Any questions here so far to how we got to the players? Team info, bracket, we're using the bracket notation here. Can someone tell me why we have to use this like colon players?
Because that's the way it's noted in the given hash.
Yeah. So if we like look at our hash here, we can see that this players key it's actually a symbol of players. It's not like a string or anything like that. So that's how we grab it again out of the hash. That's how we get it. Yeah.
Conventionally, we would just use variable names, right? Most people would use the variable with a colon after it when creating a hash, like literally, like a literal hash.
Yeah, it depends. So there's different syntax that you can use to create hashes. There's like an older syntax and like a newer syntax. Some people prefer the one, some people prefer the other. It kind of depends on, and in the labs you will encounter both. A lot of times the like modern way to write a hash would just be like, we'd say players that would point to an array. This is very much like what we have in JavaScript. It looks very much like JSON, which we'll talk about. It's kind of like, you know, we're still going to access these players as a symbol the same way, actually, but it's just written differently. All right, so we have our players. We get them by saying team info bracket players. Awesome. This gives us all of our players for each team. Now, if we take this pry out and let's exit this. So I have like for each team that I'm iterating over, I'm getting an array of players. How do I actually go about like putting all of the players together? Yeah.
You can use the concat method. And so, well, first you want somewhere to save all the players, right? Because you're just, right there, you're just accessing some players, but you're not saving them. So you can have an empty array above the each claim, and you can just call it total players or something. You set it equal to an empty array. And then call concat for each array of players, and add it to all players. So all players love concat team info players.
Someone know of another way to add something to an array? Yeah.
Push it.
Yeah. Shuffle it. Yeah, we could do that. And then how would we go about returning that array at the end?
Just return all players.
Yeah, you just write all players. There's an implicit and an explicit return in Ruby. You never are going to really have to use the explicit return. The implicit return in 98% of the cases is enough. There are a couple of cases where you might actually have to explicitly return, but since Ruby has that implicit return, try to not use the return keyword whenever you can avoid it. So in this case, what is actually returned from a method? Like, it's not this first thing, right? It's not this like stuff in the middle. It's always the last. It's always the last variable or whatever you're trying to return inside of the method. This is the last thing in method. That is what's going to be returned. If this was a put statement, what would the method return?
Nil.
Nil. Very good. Yes. Because the put statement always returns nil. Right? It will print something out to the console, but it will always return nil. And printing out to the console and printing something out to the console and returning something are different things. All right, so we can absolutely do this. Is there a shorter way of writing this? If we see this pattern, like we're creating an array, we're pushing into that array, we're returning the array. Can someone think of a shorter way? Yeah.
Type in like return all players shovel, like just put a return in front
Like
of
here?
it. Yeah. And then cut out the last all players.
Yeah, so what will happen here if we put a return in there?
Sure, you'll get the first team's players, but then it will exit, before it gets to the next team, it will exit the function, so you won't get all the players, you only get the first team's players.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So if we add like an explicit return, it'll actually push us out of that iteration first time we iterate, and then we won't get to that second one. There's actually something about the each that we could change. Yeah, say it out loud. We can use map. All right, so whenever you see this pattern, creating a variable, setting it equal to an empty array, iterating over something and pushing it into that array, and then returning that array, you can always use map instead. What map does is exactly all of those things together, but in one go. So let's, I'm gonna grab this so you guys have it like as a reference. I'm gonna comment that out, and let's use map down here. All right, so instead of each, we can just say map, because what does map do as opposed to each?
Returns an array
Yeah, it returns what kind of an array?
with new values.
A modified array. So what .each does is all it does is iterate over your array. And what does each always return? The same original array that we iterated over. Right? So whatever array we iterate over, in this case, we've got like, hash or whatever, game hash dot values. This will be returned from the .each. With a .map, we can modify the array inside. And what I mean by modify is we can actually like tell it to return a particular thing for each item in the array. For us, like what we want to return here, or what we want to have in the end is like an array of all players. So for each time that we iterate over our like team info, we can grab the players, and this will give us an array of player arrays. This will actually give us a nested array, which we'll deal with in a second. So let's throw a binding.pry in here. Can someone think of a way that we can actually look at this information that's coming from out of this in our pry? What could we do here in order to like look at what this returns?
You could save it to a variable first.
Yeah.
Name and then check the value of that name.
Exactly. So how do I save it to a variable?
So you could declare a variable.
Yeah.
You could say result equals
Result.
like game hash so and so, right? So just save the map call directly to the variable.
Yeah. So I can actually put this directly in front of my iteration, and whatever is being returned from that iteration is going to be saved to that variable. Let's run this. Let's try it out. All right, fell fast. We've got, scroll up, pull this up a little bit. Well, in our pry, we can now say result to take a look at that result that we just created. Awesome. So it looks like we've got an array, and this is like a whole bunch of players in there, but we actually have an array of arrays, right? Which kind of makes sense because we're like putting two arrays together in another array because we're doing that map. There is a way to, I don't want to say the word, again, Ruby is so intuitive with its words that it's hard to not use the method names. There's a way to like squash the two arrays into one. Flatten, yeah. So flatten, if you want to flatten, if you want to flatten two arrays, you just say flatten, right? So we could say something like result.flatten. And this will give us a flattened array. So you notice that now we just have this one square bracket here instead of two. Before it was like a nested array, right? Now it's just a flat array with all of our players just all inside of that same array. Yeah.
Just curious, would it be like a good idea, or would it be acceptable to use like reduce and reduce your your big hash so that you reduce it to one array, right? Would that work?
I think like using reduce would just be a little
Too
more
much
complicated
or
in this case. Yeah.
unnecessary?
Unnecessarily complicated.
Okay.
But again, there are like so many different ways of solving these problems. This just happens to be one. So if we call this, like, we can say result.flatten, right? Everybody on board with that? Yeah. What we can also do that's kind of cool is we can get rid of this variable and we can call .flatten directly on the end. This is like, right? How cool is that?
That's a good one. That's a good one.
So we can either create an array and like call.flatten, like create this variable call.flatten on that. That's totally fine. But Ruby allows us to call methods after an end as well. So because what all of this returns right here is that result variable that we created earlier, right? It's that like nested array. It's that whole thing returns that nested array. And then at the end, we just say, hey, now that you have this nested array, flatten it. You just say .flatten directly at the end. Yeah, this is kind of
This
cool.
lesson might actually turn me into Ruby.
Man,
JavaScript guy.
you guys are gonna love Ruby. Yeah, it's a lot of fun because it's just so intuitive and like it's a lot of fun. Everybody on board with this? Can I get like a thumbs up, or like I like to do this like thumbs up, or like where you stand with the material right now? Okay.
So
All right, cool.
flatten is just making it not a nested
Exactly.
data structure.
So before we had something that looked like this. We got like an array, right? But then we had two arrays inside of it.
So this just kind of like stretches it out so it
Just like squish it. It takes the arrays that are inside of it and just like spreads it out into one single array. So what we end up with, so we have like objects in here, right? These are my curly brackets. Now it takes each of these like objects inside, and amidst the array that's inside of it, and just like creates an array of just objects, and so on.
And that just happened during that function, right?
It happens after the map. Right. So the map is done. We're done iterating. We end up with this nested array. We call .flatten, and then we end up with this. Do you have a question, Nick?
What if you theoretically had like a giant array and you had multiple arrays inside it, but you only wanted to flatten a certain amount of arrays? Is that possible to do?
I think with flatten, like that's pretty much across the board. I'm sure there are other ways that you could like do that. What's that? Like if you want to slice, like get an array out first and then flatten the rest, you could do something like that.
Will you find that for us?
But yeah.
Oh, yeah, you could, for instance, you can.
Oh, yeah?
that's certain-
Okay. Cool. Learning something new.
You
Yeah.
find one and it'll give you one big one. Okay.
Yeah, we can check that out. Let's see if I have. Let's see. Ruby flatten.
Yeah, the first
Let's see what this tells us. Yeah, there are different ways of using these methods. Here's with an argument of 1, which will I assume what it does is it flattens it one level deep only. Yeah, and not beyond that. So that's what that does.
What's the difference between flatten and collect?
Collect is like map. In fact, I think it's exactly the same actually. And so it iterates and it leaves you with a modified array at the end. So exactly, let me look this up, but collect and map, I believe, are just different words for the same thing. There's no difference whatsoever. Yeah, so we could also use collect here, right? Potato, potato, same thing. All right, this is it. This will give us an array of players, and let's try that out. So we are calling this getPlayers method in our numPointScored. Let's throw a binding.pry in here, and let's create a variable called players set equal to whatever we call from the from that method call, whatever we get back.
You can call getPlayers before the method's defined.
You mean up here?
Yeah.
Oh, like in the, yeah. In the code, we can define it down here, but still call it up above. There's a lot more like weirder and stricter rules going on in JavaScript, but in Ruby, just like throw it in wherever. Obviously, there should be like a good sense to the order of your code and stuff, but yeah, we can totally do that. So if we run our test here again, we can look at our players now, which are it's just a variable that I created after I called the getPlayers method. And this now is an array of all of the players. So note we're starting with an array that contains an object of a player and then so on, right? So this is all of our players. Looks pretty good. What do you guys think? Is that going to be helpful? Mm-hmm. So what I did here is I created this separate method called getPlayers. I could have thrown this all into this numPointScored method, totally valid, and then go from there. But I know for a fact that we're going to have to get all the players again in another method, right? So this is just kind of making my life a little easier. And that is the reason that we create these different kinds of methods. All right, so we got a list of players. We can actually throw that like under our comment, because that's what we're doing, right? Getting a list of players. And then what we want to do is we want to find a player whose name matches what is being passed into our method here. Any ideas how we might do that? Yeah.
Sure. So there's the nice Ruby method called find.
Mm-hmm.
You can call it on the array, and then you can pass it a block. And in that block, you can check to see if you ask of each player in the array, is it the player I'm looking for?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
something like that.
Absolutely. So again, we could do this in a separate method because we might want to find another player again at some point. I'm gonna like take this the other approach. I'm gonna write it in here and then later factor it out into a method. So we have all of our players, right? You just said we could use .find.
Yeah.
And .find is also an iterator, just like .map or .collect or .each, right? So it iterates over each of the items in our array. And it takes a block as well. And one item will be one player, right? Let's make sure that we're already ending it. I got like an autocomplete for my end because I always forget. I can always recommend, like if you don't have that, always write your end right after you write your do. So like write the do and then player, start a new line, write your end before you put anything in there because you're gonna have a hard time matching them up after the file gets really big. All right, so you said correctly that we want to essentially match that player's name with the name that's being passed in, which is this player underscore name. Let's actually throw another binding pry in here because I love pry so much. We'll exit this one. Pull this up a little bit. And run our rspec. Cool. So we are in our pry where we're trying to find certain players. So right here, maybe I'm not quite sure what is player actually, right? What is maybe even like the player name that's being passed in? I can check all the stuff out here. I just play around with it. Say player name. That's the argument that's being passed in here, right? Cool. This is like coming from the tests. So the tests are passing in this name right here that I'm just pulling out. I can also look at my player from our iteration. So I can see, oh man, this is my first player. It just happens to be that same player. What a coincidence. I know that for a different test, this is not going to be the case, but this just happens to be like the same player, right? So how do we actually, we have the player name, that string. We need to compare it to what now from our player object? We can see that, so we essentially, like we want to compare this, which is our player name, to like something in here, right? And all we have right now is this giant object. How do we pull, first of all, what do we want to pull out of here? The name, right? The player name. How do we access that? How do we access this string?
The key player name.
With the key player name. What does that look like? If I say, I have to say player something?
It would be a colon, right? If you symbol.
Mm-hmm. Square brackets, don't forget those. And then I got our colon because it's a symbol, and then player underscore name. And that gives me the value for that particular key. Yeah.
Can you not use dot notation when you're doing that in Ruby?
No, unfortunately. Yeah, and I'll probably still try to do it every once in a while because I'm used to JavaScript. But yeah, no, you can't. Unfortunately, you can't do that here.
Well, if you made it with like a JavaScript object notation, like the colons in front of the key name, like in the arrow, could you do it then? Or you just can't do it at all? You just always use brackets?
Let's try it out. My object.
Would it be but then how would the interpreter know whether it's a string or a symbol? I'm just wondering if that makes a difference.
Yeah. So if I created an object here with the key of name, colon, and then like the name, right? Got Bob here, and we say my object, brackets, colon, name. We get the name back. Now we try dot name, and we get an undefined method name for Bob for the hash. So this is
Dot notations are methods.
I'm sorry?
They're methods.
Oh, so
We're trying to call.
So you can't do properties dot notation because it's reserved for methods?
I'm not exactly sure if like that's the reason, but that is how it is. I don't know how they design, why and how they designed the language, but yeah, if you're going to use dot notation, I think there's no other thing. It's going to expect some kind of method. All right, so we're stuck with brackets here. Cool. So let's copy this. What we figured out in our pry, how to get the actual name of the player from the object, and we're going to set this equal, or we're going to check. No, not 3, just 2. This is 2 equal signs, by the way. I have my editor makes it kind of look like a really long one. Just know that this is just 2 equal signs, not 1. So with the find, what we always want to do is we want to find gets us 1 element out of our array. Right? It only the first one it finds, the first one it matches. It's like, all right, I got it. I got the element. I'm going to use this. What we do inside of find is we essentially say, hey, we're iterating over this array of players. Find me the one where the player with the key of player name, so that string, equals the player name that is passed into our method up here. Right? Wherever those 2 are equal, give me that player. Like spit that player out. Cool. All right, so this should give me a single player. And in fact, let's try that out. We say player equals, we put a binding pry down here. Let's exit our pry. We're in an iteration. Does someone know how I would entirely exit an iteration? What's that? Break? I don't know if break works. Let's try it. No.
Exit exclamation point.
Exit exclamation point. I can use that, absolutely. Exit exclamation point will take me out of the entire iteration. So if you have like a lot going on, you just want to get out, just add the exclamation point. All right, let's run it one more time because we want to look at our player. We hit Q here, we say player, and this gives us the actual player object that we're looking for. because this method is called num points scored, what we actually in the end want to get is the number of points scored that for that particular player, right? So since we have this player already, how do we get the num points scored out of here? Where are they even? Number 2 points. That looks promising there. I think that's what they're looking for. Again, we're dealing with a hash here. How do we grab a value from that hash? Player bracket notation, colon, points. This will give us the actual value of points. Let's grab that. And that is return that player's points. So we're going to paste that in there because that's like the last thing we're doing. And we should be good.
Seems like we don't want to directly return players' points before checking to see if there is a player, though. Because imagine players nil, then you're going to get an error.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So for this lab that we're doing, we don't have to worry about it too much. But you bring up a really good point that if we are looking for something that doesn't exist, we want to put some kind of fail-safe in there. Hey, if this doesn't exist, if you can't find it, make sure that you don't go that you don't continue. Just.
Yeah, I was wondering. So none of was validation deliberately left out from all these methods to make it simpler to approach, or?
Yeah, we'll get to validations and that kind of stuff. Yeah, a lot. If you know some Ruby already or some programming language already. The way that a lot of these labs and the curriculum is designed is to build on top of it, like the last piece, right? So there might be a piece, it might not be 100% how you would code it in the end, but it's displayed this way in order to explain it to you a little bit more easily. We take out pieces to not make the whole thing more confusing, right? All right, yeah. Get players. Could I do that? As in replace this? Is that what you mean? Could I do that or?
Yeah.
I can't. Yeah. Is that? I can absolutely do that. Yeah. Yeah. So all I'm doing here is I'm setting this the return value of this method equal to a variable, so that I can then reuse it. But I can also actually, I probably want to keep my player here. I can say, yeah, get players.
Do you still have to keep the alpha variable?
I wouldn't. No, I could get rid of this.
Isn't that quicker?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's quicker. It's just more code in fewer lines, more, yeah. And so a lot of times you might be tempted to do something like this.
Talking about the brackets, right? So you just do one line.
I'm sorry?
So instead of doing the do and can you just do 2 brackets because you're just doing one?
Yeah, we could do that too. So there are ways to shorten the code, right? Sometimes keep in mind that shorter code isn't necessarily better. You're trying to explain someone what you're doing in your code, right? So if I wrote this in one line, which is possible, I could just write this in one long line, right? Someone looking at this would go oh my God, okay, what's going on here? So you're getting the player from this other method, then you're iterating and you're finding, and then you're getting the number of points. It takes a lot of time and this is a small method, it's fine, but it takes a lot of time to read through your code, try to figure out what's happening. You can just make the code much more explicit and say, hey, I'm getting all of my players from this method get players. Then I'm iterating on my players, and then I'm getting the points for that one player that I found. Just, it's some of it is preference. Which way do you prefer to do it? But I would always keep in mind, make your code explicit and easy to read for someone else. Code isn't just for yourself. It's for other people to look at as well. And it's for your future self. Oh my God, if I've gone back to code I wrote just a month ago, like, maybe not recently, but, and I don't understand what I did because I didn't make it very explicit, right? Tried to make it really short, but that didn't help me in the future. So feel free to add comments, make your code more explicit in writing it. That's going to help a lot. When do we start here? We're going to have to probably, I don't want to make this too long. Probably want to come to an end soon. Actually, yeah. Do you, can I get like a gauge of like how many, do you have more questions about the Hashketball lab in general? Like, are there any particular ones where you're like, oh man, I really want to know about this and I want to talk about this? Any questions you like wrote down or that come up in your mind? No? Okay. And we can like feel free to ask questions anytime. We're just gonna like finish this up and then we'll be done. Just so that this doesn't go too long. I don't want to bore you guys. Okay, so this solved our problem. One other thing we can do that we kind of did the opposite earlier is we like created this method, right, to get all of our players. And this over here, what we did is we just kind of wrote this piece of code in line within our method. But let's say we want to get another player at some point, right? Another method is supposed to find like one particular player. We could take this piece of code and factor it out in a separate method, just like we did with get players. So let's grab this. And let's grab this and let's say a player is supposed to be equal to, maybe we want to call our method get player, right? Makes sense in line with what our other methods are called. Our player method, like our get player method, we're going to have to pass a couple of things in because it needs to know, first of all, who all of the players are, and secondly, which player we want to find. Right, so we can say players, because we have that available to us. We want to pass in players. We also want to pass in like a particular player name so that we can then find it in that method. Let's create this method. Def get player. This will take 2 arguments. First, players, right? Second, player name. Awesome. And then I'm just going to copy and I'm just going to paste the code in there that I just copied. Now we have to refactor just a little bit. This is not get players anymore. This is just players. So this is coming from our argument. And we're still comparing it. We just happen to be named the same, like happen to have the same variable name. And this will now return one particular player. And up here, we are calling that method. And we are getting this one player out. We're still using everything else the same that we did before. Creating methods, especially with arguments, and calling them can sometimes be a little, can at first be a little bit tough to understand. So I want to make sure that like this is clear to everyone. What I pass in here into my get player method, the players and the player name, they're all variables that exist because once I'm calling the method, these variables that I'm passing in have to exist, right? So players comes from my line 112 here, and player name comes from my argument for my num points scored method. These are all things that exist already that I'm passing into the get player method in order to get me that single player. When in a method definition, this right here is a method definition, it's not a method call. This up here is a method call, this is a method definition. In a method definition, I can call these whatever I want, right? I can say, hey, I want players to be called potatoes, right? And I want player name to be called, I don't know, apples. As long as I use the same variable names that I have in my arguments inside of my method, I can name them whatever I want. Obviously, it makes sense to name something that makes sense. This doesn't make that much sense. But in the method definition, whatever you call the arguments, all this stuff, all Ruby does is when you call a method, it's like, oh, the first argument is players. I'm just going to match that up with my first argument in my method definition, right? Second argument is player name. That will now be Apple. So what in the method definition, whatever you call these up here, doesn't really matter, as long as you use them inside of your method as intended. Because I get a lot of misconceptions about students will say like, oh, doesn't in my get player method, doesn't the first argument have to be called players because I called it players up here? It doesn't, because this is up there is just the method call that calls the method that will say, hey, this is the first argument. I will associate to this piece of the to this particular first argument, and then the second one, same thing. So it just matches the arguments. The name doesn't matter. Is everybody? Can I get like a? How do you guys feel about that? Yeah, cool. All right, let's name this. Get rid of this. Okay, looks a little better. All right, so this code will work just the same as our code before, and in fact, I don't think we've ever even tried if this works. Let's run this, and we can see that we get our next error. That means our last one passed. Right, there's that little green dot here to show that we passed the last one. Cool. And we could write this, again, we could write this super short if we wanted to. We could say something like get players. And then we'll get player. So we could pass in get players to player, and then we could say brackets, colon, points. This is the equivalent of these 3 lines up here. Yeah.
I don't know. It struck me as a little like. I know that it seems like the style is to not, when you don't have an argument, you're going to pass to a function when you call it, not to use the parentheses. But doesn't that give you less information? Like, for example, there, I might not know whether get players is sort of a variable or a function being called.
That's a really good point, yeah. Yeah, I never really thought about that, but that's so true. Yeah, so if we add the parentheses here, nothing will really change. Like, this will still pass just as it did before. Running low, we have to end it soon. In JavaScript, you need this. In Ruby, it's optional. So if you don't have arguments, you don't need the parentheses to call the method. I actually like that. Like, if you add the parentheses, it makes it clearer about that this is a method. Yeah, feel free. You're not going to see this everywhere. A lot of people would try to like write it shorter like that. I actually don't see a good reason why you would. So if you guys want to just go for adding the parentheses when it's a method call, totally fine. Great suggestion.
I like passing in the methods though. On get player, I think that's nice.
Like this right here?
Yeah. I mean, as long as you have all those methods below it, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. This. Right. So you could like do this all in one line if you wanted to. They're completely different ways of like writing this.
And also, obviously, what would contribute the most to understanding would be different depending on sort of your audience or who you're writing the code for. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, how do you sort of, because often those ways will be different, how do you decide which way to write the method given that if these people are going to use it or these people, those 2 people will gain more understanding. These guys will gain more understanding if you choose way 1. These guys will gain more understanding if you choose way 2. So how do you sort of decide?
Right. That's a good question. So actually, usually what you'll be dealing with in an actual job is an existing code base. When what happens with an existing code base, there's some kind of style to how people write their methods, how they, comment things. That's what you'll have to adopt. So I hope that kind of answers your question. Like, most of the time you'll actually, like in the real world, you'll get existing code, and no matter how you like to write your code, you should adopt that style of writing the code. Yeah.
This is my thought about it on day one.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me, if it were up to me, I would write
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Yeah, and then you know, a little bit of like your flair comes in there. Which one do you prefer? If it really doesn't matter, use the one that you prefer maybe. Yeah, but a lot of times you'll get code, you'll have to adapt to that. All right, this is the end here. I know that so the point of this lecture isn't to go through everything, but it's to kind of explain how you would approach a problem like this. I hope that helped you guys. If you have more questions, let me know. If you have any questions like right now about anything we did, I would love to answer them. There like any last questions? Let me kind of pull this out a little bit. These are, if I make this smaller, these are the methods we wrote. Not quite. It's a little. All right, this is everything we wrote. If you can see it from back there, we got the num point scored. We got the get player. We got the get players. A lot of comments that aren't super necessary, but yeah, just so you guys have it. All right. One other thing that I didn't mention earlier is one thing that is Flatiron tradition that we do after a lecture is either clap or snap. You guys are welcome to do either one. Somehow, yeah, do a mix of both. Yeah. At this campus, for some reason, like snaps are kind of winning, but you know you can bring the claps back. I'm down with whatever. Yeah, so this was it for the first one. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And again, the video will be uploaded, the code will be uploaded, everything that we've done here will be uploaded. You'll find that on the Learn page, and you can go back if you want to check it out again. All right, let's get back to the main room. Thank you, guys.